Everyone in Nzambi knew the richest merchant in town. Everyone knew his starched shirts, his strict ways, his big store with shelves full of things. But almost no one saw how thin his breath had become, how his hands shook when he thought no one was watching. Only one person noticed, and she was the last one anyone would expect, the girl with the broom. A poor housekeeper noticed a symptom that no one else did and saved the richest merchant in the village. His name was Wim. Some called him Wimabala, and he was the wealthiest man in the village. To him, Clara Ara was nothing more than the girl with the broom. He disliked her plain clothes, her soft steps, and her quiet way. He treated her like air, like dust in the corner. What he did not know was that, while his own family walked past him without seeing, this woman saw everything. Clara Ara saw what no one else could. The silent sickness eating him from inside, the small bottles he hid behind old books, the fear he covered with pride. When she tried to warn his wife the first time, they laughed at her and sent her back to the floor with a cloth in her hand. So she did what she could. She prayed. She watched. She waited. And when the fall finally came, when people ran in circles and looked for someone to blame, the only person who held the key to saving him was the housekeeper he had always treated as if she did not exist. People say wealth shows a man's true heart. As Professor Diego Mays used to say, money does not create character, it reveals it. In Wimabala's case, it only made harder what was already hard and closed inside his soul. He owned the biggest dry goods store in the village of Nzambi. He was known for his punctual hours, his pressed collars, and for never missing a chance to push down anyone who earned less than he did. He stood tall in public, but the pride under his clean coat stung like vinegar. He would not sit at a table with anyone wearing flip-flops. If he saw a shirt with frayed cuffs, he looked away. He could not stand the smell of sweat, the coo of the pigeon in the square, or the simple way people wore life on their skin and clothes. To him, poor people spoke of illness only because they had nothing else to say, and they prayed only because they were too lazy to work. His voice filled the store's halls as if each word he spoke was worth more than his workers' pay. He called the manager by his last name, Kabasa, like he was calling a dog. He shouted at the delivery man, Lent, for being 2 minutes slow. He told the guard, Pedra, that his job was to stand still and not use his head. Clara, though, he rarely said her name. At most he said with a tired wave, the girl with the broom. As if even that effort annoyed him, as if just remembering she existed was a bother. Clara Ara entered by the back door before the rooster spoke. She held the mop like it was a legacy from her mother, and she carried the bucket as if it had grown from her own arm. She never touched the front steps. She knew the narrow place the world had given her, and inside Wim's house, her place was to be unseen. When he walked past, he did not greet her. If she dropped something and bent to catch it, there was no thank you. If she scrubbed a floor twice and made it shine, the room was quiet as if the work had done itself. It was as if she had no soul, only hands to scrub and a back to bend. Even so, Clara Ara did not hate him. Her heart was trained by faith. She knew life turns like a wheel, and not everyone survives the bend. Wim believed he was above bends and wheels and storms. He never visited the lower side of the village. He never stepped into a lane of hard dirt where children ran barefoot and laughed anyway. He said those people played the victim. He said begging was a choice. He said prayer was an excuse for those who could not make a deal. The only faith he knew was profit, and he did not even share that. Deep down, the store was a mirror of his soul. It had everything you could buy and nothing you could not. The employees obeyed from fear, not respect. His wife walked the aisles, with jewels that sparkled like ice, while the silence between them weighed more than any necklace. The children, raised like little princes, spoke loudly but never learned how to listen. There was plenty on the shelves and a shortage in the gestures. Clara Ara saw all of this and kept her lips closed. She carried an old kind of wisdom that does not need a stage. She understood that Wim tossed others away like trash because he could not face his own emptiness. She knew that those who look down on the one who cleans the floor are often the ones carrying the most dirt inside. It was in this split world, between those who command and those who obey, between suits and headcloths, that the story drew its first deep breath. In the scorn Wim threw at Clara Ara, there hid a hand that would one day save him. In the blindness that guided his days, There was a muted warning that only someone who cleaned corners would ever see. She came before the sun, most days while the stars were still fading. The morning had not taken its first breath, and she was already sweeping the yard, pushing away dry leaves and the loneliness that blew in with them. She was thin, with a curved back and hands hard from use. The marks on her palms were not only from work, but from the weight of a life that pressed down year after year. She wore no watch. Her time was set by the rooster's cry, the smell of coffee that rose from the big house, and the kettle that sang at the same hour each day. No one saw her arrive. No one asked if she had slept. No one asked her full name. But Clara Ara saw everything. When she wiped down the tiles in the master bathroom, she heard muted quarrels through the carved wooden door. She knew when Dona Nzinga spent long hours on the phone telling her sister that Wim was no longer the man she married. She knew when the younger son came home late, hiding the alcohol on his breath with mint lozenges and laughs that were too loud. She knew the eldest daughter had cried in her room and would not say why. And most of all, she knew Wim was changing, not from pride or vanity, as they all claimed, but because something in him was slowly fading like a light at dusk. Clara Ara did not hold a degree, but she had eyes. More than that, she had quiet. The kind of quiet that listens and understands without asking. The kind of listening that goes straight to where pain lives, even when it never speaks. When Wim coughed upstairs, she could tell from the sound how many steps he had climbed before he had to stop. When he sat in his office looking at the wall, she noticed the small tremor in his right hand, the one he tried to hide by folding his fingers. She noticed the color leave his cheeks by degrees. She picked stained handkerchiefs from the trash, folded in a hurry, and knew they were not a mess. They were fear. No one else noticed. The children were busy. Phones, trips, photos, friends, the noise of a life always looking outward. The wife chased new dresses, new furniture, new reasons to be looked at. The workers did as they were told, kept their heads down, and tried not to invite trouble. Only Clara Ara knelt to clean the floor. And from that low, honest place, she saw what those above chose not to see. She knew about the dark glass bottle hidden behind a row of old books, label worn soft from his hands. A bottle he glared at as if it insulted his manhood. She knew he ate less, leaving half a plate untouched and blaming the cook's seasoning, when the truth was the steady nausea that would not leave him. She knew he pretended to nap at the desk, but was only bent forward, breathing shallow, pressing through a pain that lived in his own lungs. She saw Wim's sick soul as clearly as she saw the dust in the corners of the living room, and she said nothing. Not yet. She knew the wisdom of the poor. Speaking too soon is like wasting a prayer. So she prayed instead. Every morning, before picking up the bucket, before folding rags, before hanging the sheets on the line, she closed her eyes. Show him, Lord, what I already see. Open his eyes before it is too late. Then she went back to work. She washed the windows until the light felt clean. She polished the furniture until a hand left no trace. She dusted the shelves and set things straight. But more than anything, she cleaned with her eyes what the world soiled with pride. Clara Ara was a woman who knew how to keep still. Inside that stillness, a true thing lived. A truth no one else wanted to hear. And one day, that quiet, full of faith and close watching, would turn into a cry that saved a life. Still, the days stretched. The store stayed busy. Wim's voice stayed loud. At the counter, he found reasons to scold. In the office, he found reasons to delay the check that was already due. He laughed at other men's worries and said they lacked courage. He stood at the balcony and turned his face away from the alley below where boys kicked a ball made of rags. His body wore its good suit. His heart wore tiredness. He did not see it. The ones he needed to see it did not try. Only the woman with the broom counted his breaths and measured his pauses. That morning, something shifted. Before dawn, a hush lay over the yard that felt too heavy for clear weather. The sky did not threaten rain, but it held a weight. The smell inside the house seemed thicker, as if the air had stopped moving. Words fell in fragments. People crossed rooms without speaking. Wim did not come down for coffee. The kettle whistled twice and blew steam into an empty kitchen. The cook tapped lightly at his office door. He grumbled and told her to leave the tray outside. His wife, already restless, said he was making a scene. She said nothing was wrong, only the sore pride of a tired man who wanted attention. Clara Ara knew better. She could feel it the way a woman who has scrubbed floors for years can feel where water will pool without looking. She knew his soul was calling out and no one wanted to hear it. She waited, not from fear but from care, for a moment when words might land. She watched the house settle into its late morning rhythm. The workers crossed the yard. The guard adjusted his belt and looked at the gate. The children sent messages and planned the afternoon. Up on the porch, the lady of the house sat with a jewelry catalog open, her finger tracing numbers more than stones. She looked at prices, not at sparkle. The sun slid a stripe of light across the tabletop and stopped at the edge of the page. Clara Ara walked forward slowly with a dish towel still wet in her hands. She cleaned the small wooden table by the porch railing even though it was already clean. Her eyes were on her work, then on the mistress, then back on the same circle. She took a breath that was almost a prayer. "Dona Nzinga," she began softly, as if asking for permission to exist. "Forgive me for saying this, but the boss looks very pale. His hands are trembling. He has been coughing a lot. Maybe it would be good to see a doctor." The words hung in the air. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Donna Nzinga slammed the catalog shut. She turned her face slowly, as if looking at an insect that had dared to land where it shouldn't. Her eyes pierced Clara with an icy contempt. Then, in a firm and sharp voice, she said, "Take care of the cleaning, Clara, not the health of others." That was all, but it hurt more than a slap. Clara lowered her eyes, clenched the dish towel tightly, and felt her face burn. She didn't cry in front of her. She didn't say anything else. She just turned around, went back to the kitchen, and let the tears fall into the sink, mixed with the soap from the dishes. She stayed there for a while, washing non-stop as if she also wanted to clean away the humiliation now sticking to her skin. She knew she shouldn't have spoken. She knew that to those in the big house, those who clean the floor, don't have the right to look at faces, let alone open their mouths to suggest something that could be seen as concern. Because people like her don't worry. They only serve, but still, she didn't regret it. She'd rather be humiliated for trying to save someone than stay silent and watch the tragedy unfold. That night, Clara didn't sleep well. She stayed on her mat in Thesmall room at the back, listening to the wind hit the door, and praying. She prayed with her heart, with her weary soul. She prayed as only someone who has been silenced many times knows how to pray. She asked God to do what she could no longer do, to speak where her voice was no longer allowed to show what she'd seen. And even without knowing it, at that moment her prayer was already being answered. Because the following morning something would begin to crumble and no jewel on Nzinger's neck, no suit and whim and no property title would be able to hold it back. It was an ordinary day, at least it seemed so. The sun had not yet touched the high sky, and Wimambala store was already full. People coming and going, carrying bags, asking for prices, complaining about change. Inside, the sound of footsteps on the waxed floor mixed with hurried voices and the noise of goods being stacked. Everything was functioning as usual, or almost. That morning, Wim was quieter than usual. His deep-set eyes, pale skin, and the suit hanging on his shoulders, as if it were too heavy. He walked through the store's aisles like a man trying to remember what it was like to live. He answered questions with nods, couldn't finish his sentences. A drop of sweat ran down his forehead without effort, and still no one stopped to look. No one thought there was anything wrong. After all, he was the boss, and bosses don't get sick. Bosses command. Bosses give orders. Bosses don't fall. But he fell. It was in the middle of the store. The silence hit like a punch in the air. Yukim collapsed suddenly like a tree cut at the roots. His body hit the smooth floor, and the dry sound of the impact echoed among the customers. The eyes first saw the wrinkled suit, then the hand outstretched without strength, and finally the face turned to the side with lips parted, searching for air that wouldn't come. The rush began. They called the wife. They called the children. They even called the old pharmacist from the village who arrived with a borrowed stethoscope. Then they called a doctor from the city, a man in a light suit with a serious expression who arrived with urgency in his steps. He examined Wim, asked for silence, applied injections, murmured diagnosis. In the end, he said what Clara already knew. He hasn't been well for a long time. This didn't start today. At the big house, the atmosphere turned to lament. The wife began to blame stress. She said Wim worked too much, never rested, always carried everything alone. The eldest son said the problem was with the employees, that no one had warned, that no one had cared. He threw hard looks at the faces of the staff, as if searching for someone to blame for the illness that they had refused to see. But Clara Ara only looked in silence because she had already spoken. She had already seen. She had already asked. They took Wim to the city hospital. He was admitted. Machines were hooked to his body. Veins were pierced with needles. Heartbeats were measured, lungs examined, and he, the man who once looked down on everyone, now lay in a bed with his eyes closed, breathing with difficulty, without a suit, without command, without a voice. For the first time, Wimabala had no control over anything. Meanwhile, the store fell silent. The employees walked slowly, not knowing what to say. The wife didn't leave the hospital. The children argued among themselves about who would be in charge now, and Clara continued cleaning, wiping the counter as she had always done, but with a heart at war. Because seeing the fall of someone who despised you is not a victory. It's an open wound. It's a sadness that brings no pride. It's a bitter confirmation that no one wanted to hear the truth. In the village, the whisper started. Some said it was punishment. Others said it was envy from others. But few, very few, remembered that there was a woman who already knew, who had already tried to warn, who had already looked into the eyes of the truth, but had been silenced with disdain. The illness came before the recognition, before the apology, before the you were right, before the thank you. And now everything depended on a fragile hope and a memory that surprisingly only Clara would be able to reach. The city hospital stood atop a hill with long corridors and windows that overlooked a dusty horizon. It was a place where life and death stared at each other every day, and where the sound of breathing machines was as common as the roosters crow in the village. It was there that Wim Mabala, the most feared man in the village, was laid down as just another sick person among many, without his suit, without demands, without speeches, just a vulnerable body connected to tubes, surrounded by silence. In the first days, he barely opened his eyes. When he did, he saw only shadows. Sometimes his wife beside the bed with a stiff expression and her phone in hand. Sometimes his children hurried and impatient as if they were wasting precious time. No one knew for sure what was wrong with him. The doctors spoke of a respiratory infection, a silent crisis, a history of neglect. But deep down, everyone felt that it went beyond the physical. Wim seemed unwilling to return. It was one of those mornings as he struggled to breathe that Clara arrived at the hospital with trembling hands. She brought a small bag with clean clothes and an object that to the eyes of others seemed insignificant. But to Wim it was almost everything. It was the blue cup. It wasn't a pretty cup. It had a small chip on the edge, and the design had faded with time. But it was the one Wim used every morning in silence as he took refuge in his office. Clara washed that cup with more care than any other object. And one day, unintentionally, she saw when he slipped a pill into it before taking it secretly. From then on, she understood that cup was not just a habit. It was a hiding place, a ritual, a secret in the hospital. He murmured incoherent things he called names no one recognized, complained of pains. But one morning while the doctor was examining him and his wife was absent, he mumbled something with dry lips. The cup blew. The cup. The nurse approached, trying to understand. The children, upon hearing, thought it was delirium. But Clara, who had been quietly standing in a corner of the room, straightened up. She knew what it was about. She took the cup out of the bag, approached with slow steps, and held weak hand. "It's here, boss. It's here just how you like it," she said. Her voice choked. We opened his eyes. For the first time in days, he looked at her slowly. His eyes were cloudy, but there was something there. A spark of recognition, a whisper of gratitude. And then he smiled, small, weak, but real. The first smile Clara had ever received from him in her entire life. The doctor who had been watching the scene approached. Curious, she asked Clara to explain, and she did. She spoke of the symptoms, the schedules, the behaviors. She told them when she first saw the tremor, when she found the blood-stained handkerchiefs, when she noticed he was hiding his medication. She spoke with the clarity of one who observes with love, even without being loved, with the precision of someone who has never been heard, but has always known how to listen. The doctor, impressed, said not a word. She only looked at the children and said, "Listen." To this woman. It was Clara who insisted on the new test. It was she who described the symptoms the doctors had not considered. It was because of her that they discovered the real problem. A severe silent lung infection which, if diagnosed days earlier, could have spared him pain and hospitalization. That day something changed. Not only in Wim's health, which began to improve slowly, but in the way everyone around him looked at Clara. For the first time, she was no longer just the girl with the broom. She was someone who had seen what no one else saw, who had cared without being asked, who had saved a life with a small gesture, and with a memory that time could not erase. The blue cup returned home a few days later, washed and placed back on the shelf. But now it was more than a piece of porcelain. It was a symbol of a bond that pride had almost prevented from existing. And Clara said nothing. She simply went back to work in silence as always. But inside her a flame had been lit because she knew. She knew that sometimes it's in the humblest gesture that the true miracle resides. in the hospital with white walls and the smell of ether, where urgency often walks hand in hand with coldness, Clara was just another shadow in silence, sitting on a plastic bench, her worn-out skirt covering her knees and her gaze fixed on the room where we breathed with assistance. To everyone there, she was just an aide, a background figure. But there was a nurse, young with attentive eyes and a heart more open than protocol, who began to notice that this woman was not ordinary. The nurse's name was Symptom. She came from another village, the daughter of a midwife, the granddaughter of a healer. She had learned early on that illness is not only treated with medicine, but with listening, with respect, with what medicine calls empathy, and the people call feeling with the other. She saw in Clara Ara's eyes a truth that the lab coats ignored, and she decided to ask, "Donor Clara, do you know your boss well?" Clara hesitated. She lowered her eyes as if fearing to be reprimanded again. But Symptom smiled, a light smile without judgment. And then Clara spoke, not as someone trying to show off, but as someone who could no longer bear the weight of the truth alone. She told everything from the first tremors in his hand to the constant pallor, from the hidden pills behind the books to the muffled coughing fits. Small but accurate details, dates, times, habits, things only seen by those who clean with the eyes of the soul. The nurse listened without interrupting. She wrote everything down. Then, without telling anyone, she took the information to the attending physician. It was a short but serious conversation. The doctor furrowed her brow, took the test papers and ordered new tests, more specific, more in dash depth. Days later, the result came. It was not just fatigue, stress, or a common infection. There was a chronic inflammatory process worsened by months of neglect and denial, a condition that could have been fatal if Clara had not spoken, if Salome had not listened, if in that cold hallway, two simple women had not combined their knowledge, one of observation, the other of listening. The doctor called Wim's children. They entered the room with the arrogant air of those who think they're heirs before their time. And there in front of them, she said, "This woman here, your housekeeper, may have saved your father's life, because she saw, she paid attention, and she had the courage to speak when no one wanted to listen." There was an uncomfortable silence. The children looked at Clara as if they were seeing her for the first time, and they were because until that moment she had been just a shadow behind the mop. But now she was light. She was living memory. She was a witness to what the eyes blinded by comfort refused to see. The news began to circulate through the hospital corridors. The older doctors frowned. The younger ones began asking who that woman with simple speech and deep eyes was, who knew so much. Salome, for her part, didn't say much. She just continued her work. But now, with more respect in her gaze, she knew she had helped not only to save a life, but to restore a forgotten truth. That wisdom doesn't come with a badge. That care is not taught in medical school, that the humble often see deeper because they live closer to pain. Wim slowly began to improve. Still weak, still breathing with difficulty, but showing signs of recovery. And every time he opened his eyes, he would ask in a whisper, "Is she here?" He was referring to Clara Ara, the woman who had once been invisible and now was present. The only one who had seen beyond the body, beyond the illness, beyond the silence. In room but 404 of the hospital, that dusty late afternoon, the housekeeper and the nurses sat side by side. They didn't exchange many words, but there was between them an understanding that didn't need to be said, because both knew that in that moment they had done what no one believed. They had changed the course of a man's history, a man who was only now beginning to see life with the right eyes. It only took a rumor to pass through the hospital door for by the next day the entire village to be talking. And it wasn't about the health of the wealthiest merchant, nor about the late diagnosis or the sudden improvement. It was about who, in fact, had saved Wimabala, and how at the cassava stalls and the well lines in the shade of the trees. Women and men whispered. They say it was the housekeeper, that one, the widow, Clara, right? Some spoke with admiration, others with doubt. And there were those who mocked housekeeper saving the boss. That's a made-up story. At Master Guga's barber shop, the old storyteller Clara Ara's name became the center of debate. One man commented, "You can see the face, but not the heart. That woman cleans floors, but it seems like she sees more than a doctor." Another rebutted, "Maybe it was just luck. The boss gets better, and now people want to make her a saint." But Guer, with his razor in hand and tired eyes from too much life, slowly said, "A miracle is when humility sees what pride ignores, and that Clara has plenty of the topic reached the church too." During the Wednesday service, while the faithful were praising, her sister asked for prayer for Wim's health. She prayed for blessings, healing, and for God to restore that family's home. But curiously, no one mentioned Clara. It was as if she still didn't fit in that altar. as if her presence were too strong for eyes that only see when someone wears nice clothes. It was at the end of the service, when everyone was preparing to leave, that the pastor, a man of few words, raised his voice. The church went silent. He looked at the pews, looked at the open door, and said, "Some serve God with a Bible in their hands, and some serve with a rag. But there are also those who have miracles in their eyes, and those are the ones who clean what no one else wants to see." He didn't say Clara's name. It didn't need to. Those who had to understand, understood. In the village, her name began to circulate more often. The neighbors started whispering, "She's always been quiet, but it seems like God listens to her prayers." The owner of the corner store, who had once barely looked Clara in the eye, now offered a discount on rice. The seamstress's daughter, who used to laugh at Clara's worn clothes, now greeted her with respect, but still Noon had the courage to call her name firmly. It was as if everyone was rediscovering that figure who had always been there, silent, constant, invisible. Clara, for her part, did not change her pace. She continued waking up early, sweeping the porch of the house where she worked, hanging sheets in the yard with the same dignity as before. When asked if it was true, she simply smiled. Not with vanity, but with that kind of smile that only someone with true faith knows how to give. The smile of someone who knows that heaven saw, even though the earth still takes time to recognize. But inside, something had already changed. It wasn't pride. It was serenity. Clara knew that even without a celebration, without a microphone, without a medal on her chest, she had done what few would do. She saw, she cared, she alerted, and she remained steadfast even when silenced. And now the village was starting to see. The old saying went, "Even the stone shouts when the heart doesn't listen." And in that village, used to silencing the humble, the stones began to tell the story of a woman who, with a rag in hand and attentive eyes, cleaned not just the floor of a house, but the dormant soul of an entire people. Wimala left the hospital with slow steps, a little more hunched than when he entered, and with a gaze that no one recognized. He no longer wore a starched suit, nor polished shoes. He wore a simple shirt buttoned up to the neck, and a straw hat that covered part of his face marked by time and illness. He looked like a different man, not in body, which was still the same, strong, imposing, but now weakened. It was in spirit. The look of someone who returns from the edge of the abyss is not the same as the look of someone who has never been there. The first thing he asked for, even before stepping foot in his home, was to see Clara. His wife pretended not to understand. The children looked surprised, but Wim was clear. "I want to speak with the housekeeper." And it was the first time he used that word, housekeeper, not maid, not girl with the broom, not servant. And that coming from him was more than a change of vocabulary. It was recognition that isn't asked for, it's felt. Clara was in the yard, hanging clean cloths on the line. When they called her, she dried her hands on her apron, adjusted her skirt, and went slowly without fear. She knew something had changed, but didn't know what. When she entered the room, she found Wim sitting, his hands on his knees, his eyes fixed on her. There was no arrogance, no hardness. There was a humble weariness and a gratitude that struggled to emerge. "Donner Clara," he said, his voice still weak but firm. "He wanted to ask you for something." She remained silent. She waited. "I wanted you to stay here, but not like before. The house needs someone like you, someone who sees, someone who cares, someone who watches over." Clara took a deep breath. There was no anger in her, no euphoria, just a serene peace of someone who is no longer surprised by the twists of the world. She looked at him with sweetness and firmness and responded, "I don't clean for a salary, Mr. Wim. I never did. I clean because I see and because seeing hurts. I clean because I can't stand to let what rots hide what still shines. I clean because sometimes what needs the most washing isn't the floor." Wim lowered his eyes. For the first time in a long time, like someone seeing themselves in the mirror, that is the other. Like someone realizing that even having everything, they lived their life without truly looking at anyone, not even at themselves. There was a beautiful silence between them. It wasn't empty. It was full of recognition, of unspoken forgiveness, of shared memory. He didn't insist. He simply nodded, as if accepting that there are things that can't be bought, can't be forced, can't be held. And Clara, without making a fuss, turned and went back to the yard. She had clothes to gather, floors to sweep. And now, more than ever, she knew that all of it had value. That day, Wim didn't call any employee by a nickname. He didn't shout orders. He didn't belittle anyone. He began to observe. And in this observing, he started to notice what always escaped him. That greatness is not in commanding, but in recognizing that respect is not imposed with shouting, but with humble silence before those who serve with soul. And Clara, even without a badge, without a raise, without a title, began to be called Donor Clara Ara by the children, by the neighbors, by the very employees. And Wim, now awake to more than life, began to repeat. Between one sip of tea and another, she saw what no one saw. And if it weren't for her, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. Days after Wim's return to the village, the store's partners were called to a special meeting. It was a stifling Saturday with a covered sky and still air, one of those days when time seems to carry omens. In the back hall of the store where only profits, stock, and goals were once discussed. Now a group of men sat in silence, waiting for the boss, who until recently had seemed unshackable. Dewey entered slowly, but with dignity. He no longer wore a suit, only a simple linen shirt, loose pants, and worn shoes. But something in his presence silenced the room. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the weight of the truth he now carried with ease. He paused, looked around, and began to speak. For years, I thought I knew everything about this store. Every product, every penny, every employee. It thought that simply looking from above was enough to understand what was happening here. But sick, I realized that even though I was at every meeting, I was blind. The partners exchanged uncomfortable glances. Wim continued. While I thought I was in control of everything, there was one woman who saw what no one else did, who felt my pain before I did, who tried to warn but was silenced, who saved my life without a diploma, without being heard, without even being called by name. A thick silence fell over the room. We took a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He unfolded it calmly and placed it on the table. This is the proposal to include Donor Clara as a symbolic part of the store's profits. Not out of charity, but out of merit, because she saw, because she cared, because she was here every single day. Some swallowed hard. One or two laughed awkwardly, as if they didn't understand the gravity of what they were hearing. But Wim didn't flinch. How many of you have swept this floor? How many of you have been here before the sun rose? How many of you knew where I kept the hidden medicine? No one. But she knew, and because of that she deserves this. At the door of the room, standing with a still damp cloth in her hands, was Clara Ara. She had been called there without knowing why. She listened in silence as she always had, but now with tear-filled eyes. When she heard her name spoken aloud, everyone turned. For the first time, they all looked at her with attention. Backwame pointed to her. This woman knows more about this store than any one of us. Because she sees, because she feels, because she has something that many here have lost soul. Clara didn't move. She simply lowered her eyes as if carrying the weight of the emotion with humility. When Wim finished, some partners clapped, others nodded insolence. The paperwork was signed right then and there. And that afternoon, the store gained a new history. A history where recognition didn't come from above, but from within. As she left, Clara simply thanked him, and as always went back to sweeping the hallway. But that day, every step she took echoed differently. She was no longer the girl with the broom. She was Donna Clara. She was the guardian of the house. She was the living memory of everything that had been forgotten, and now finally remembered with honor. Wim stayed behind, watching her walk away. He knew he hadn't bought forgiveness nor earned affection, but he had done something greater. He had recognized in front of everyone that greatness lies where few have the courage to look. After the meeting, which spread like wildfire through the village, the entire community began to see Clara Ara with new eyes. And it wasn't because she asked. It wasn't because she changed the way she dressed or raised her voice. She remained the same firm steps, a serene gaze, simple clothes. But now something in her made others lowered their eyes with respect. It was as if suddenly everyone realized they had stepped on a flower, thinking it was a stone dot in the town square where no one used to greet her. Clara began to be called by name, not with exaggeration or flattery, but with a kind of respect that only comes when the heart learns to see. Children ran up to her to help carry her bags of laundry. Elderly women invited her to sit and have tea. Even the older men, who used to pass by her as if avoiding an object, now tipped their hats when she crossed their path. The merchant's daughter, a young woman with delicate manners, who once barely made eye contact with the maid, began visiting the humbler homes. She would bring baskets of food, clothes, and small gifts. But she never went alone. She asked Clara to come with her, and made sure to introduce her. This is Donor Clara. She takes care of our house, and she took care of our family when no one else could. At the village festivals where Clara Ara had once been hardly invited, her name began to be remembered with pride. During the annual Harvest Day celebration, the local mayor, a man with flowery speech and grand gestures, asked her to come up to the makeshift stage. He gave her a symbolic certificate, saying her story was an example for the whole community. Clara accepted the paper but didn't step onto the platform. She simply said, "I didn't do it for a prize. I did it because it was the right thing. And when you do the right thing, the rest, God takes care of it." Those words echoed, not because of the strength of her tone, but because of the truth they carried. The village, used to honoring those who flaunt, began to understand that the worth of a person is not in what they wear, but in what they carry in their heart. And more than that, they began to recognize that sometimes the greatest guardians of life are those who clean the dirt of others without ever soiling their own soul. At Joachim's store, the employees began to greet Clara with reverence. The nicknames disappeared. The boss's harsh look was replaced by a respectful nod every time she passed by. Some even said that after everything he seemed lighter, less bitter, more human, and everyone knew why. But no one dared to say it was luck. It was Clara, and now even those who once mocked her knew this to be true. There was a new spirit in the village, a new way of looking. The baker began offering free day-old bread to those who were hungry. The seamstress started mending old clothes without charging. The village began little by little to remember what it means to care for one another, as if the silent gesture of a housekeeper had also cleaned the pride accumulated in people's hearts. Clara, however, never boasted. She continued waking up early, sweeping the yard, singing old hymns while hanging clothes. But now, when she passed in front of the store, the church, or even Wim's house, no one said anymore, "Here comes the girl with the broom." Now they said, "Here comes Donna Clara, the woman who saw before everyone else." And in the hearts of those who once couldn't see, a lesson remained. Sometimes those who are at the bottom are closer to God because they see what those at the top refuse to see. Clara never asked to be noticed. She never raised her voice to demand respect. She didn't beg for recognition, nor dreamt of tributes. Her life was always made of silences full of meaning, of light steps, of hands that cleaned more than dirt. They cleaned the absences, the neglect, the unspoken wounds of the house where she worked. And perhaps because of that, when fate made justice, it didn't come with trumpets or trophies. It came with different looks, with reverent silence, with a respect that can't be bought or faked. She saved from death, yes, but she saved more than that. She saved a house from pride, a family from blindness, a whole village from indifference. Because by seeing what no one else wanted to see, Clara forced everyone to look at themselves. And in doing so, she brought to the surface what had been buried: awareness, recognition, gratitude in the store. Wim began to sit by the door. On sunny mornings, with a notebook in his lap and a gentler look in his eyes, he no longer gave orders as before. He didn't look down on the humble. And when someone asked him how he was, he would simply answer, "I'm alive because of her." He would discreetly point to Clara wherever she was hanging clothes, carrying a bucket, adjusting flowers on the porch. And those who heard this repeated phrase felt a lump in their throats, because they knew that it wasn't just about a body that healed. It was about a soul that awoke, a story that became a mirror. Clara didn't change homes. She didn't stop working. But now she was called with the respect that had been denied to her for years. And the most beautiful part was that she didn't change on the inside. She continued with the same gestures, the same whispered prayers at dawn, the same care for every corner of the house, because Clara knew that the noblest service isn't seen. It's felt, and the world at last felt it. On the last Sunday of the month during the service, the pastor looked at the congregation with tear-filled eyes and said, "After the sermon, there are people who talk about God from the pulpit, and there are people who show God with a rag in their hands. And this week, this village was touched by one of those hands." He didn't need to say anything else. Everyone knew. And Clara, sitting in the last row with the handkerchief between her fingers, let a tear fall, not out of pain, not out of pride, but out of relief. Because finally the world had understood there are eyes that see more. Because they clean more than just the floor. They clean the soul of the house. And Joachim, once blind to himself, began to repeat a phrase that would become history. "If it weren't for her, I wouldn't be here to tell the story." This is the story of Donna Clara, the woman who saw before everyone else, and who even in silence saved more than a life. She saved a forgotten truth. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our